Support for your public radio station comes from our members and from Mary Cariola Center, providing education and life skills solutions designed to empower individuals and the families of those with complex disabilities. Mary Cariola Center, transforming lives of people with disabilities. More at marycariola.org.
From WXXI News, this is Connections. I'm Patrick Hoskin. And our connection this hour on this Arts Friday edition of the show was made in July when an internal memo at the New York Times revealed that 4 of its arts critics would be reassigned to new roles. That includes TV critic Margaret Lyons, theater critic Jesse Green, classical music critic Zachary Wolfe, and longtime chief pop music critic John Pareles, who had been in that role since 1988. So the company is not killing those jobs, and in fact, there are several other critics who are remaining in their roles. But the Times is now actively searching for new hires who are fluent in, quote, new story forms, videos, and experimentation with other platforms. That's according to a memo. And the Times is looking for types of coverage that go beyond the traditional review. So this kind of shakeup is not unheard of in the modern media landscape. Multi-platform storytelling is the name of the game, and that even extends apparently to criticism. But what does it say about the health of legacy media or arts criticism when the paper of record makes a change like this? The language of the memo prompted the worker-owned publication Hellgate NYC to ask in a headline, does the NYT want culture writing or TikTok videos? That question could be extended to all of media in an age when information travels faster than ever before and competition for audience attention is cutthroat. So what is the role of the arts critic in this kind of ecosystem, and what does the future of arts criticism look like given these changes? Well, we are joined by some folks who can hopefully help answer these questions and unpack them. First and foremost, Mona Segetola-Slamy is here. Hey, Mona.
Hello, hello. Good to be joining you.
Mona's no stranger to these airwaves, of course, or this particular program. She's the WXXI classical music director, host, and producer, also someone who contributes regularly to City Magazine and sits in this seat regularly. We're joined by Eric Grody, longtime theater critic and reporter and associate professor at Syracuse University's Newhouse School and former director of the Goldring Arts, Style, and Culture Journalism program at that school. So welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Welcome back, I should say.
Thank you.
And my colleague at City Magazine, Catherine Varga, is here. Catherine is City's theater critic and also an arts educator. So Catherine, thanks a lot for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, like I said, there are 3 people in this room with me who care very deeply about the arts, 3 people who contend with the place of the arts in our lives, who practice criticism, who are very familiar with these questions and have a lot of maybe questions of their own. Maybe we'll just start. So I think for folks in our field and folks who care about the arts and who kind of are into this discipline, what did you make of this news about the New York Times critics being reassigned when you heard that? Is it a big deal? Is it the death of arts criticism, as perhaps been suggested, or is it like a necessary sign of the times? Mona, what do you think? I wanted to start with Mona because Mona and I were having a great conversation about this right before we started.
Well, I guess I was mostly surprised when they said they wanted new forms. Each of these journalists, I think, would be equipped to tell stories in new forms. And in fact, Zachary Wolfe, who I know primarily through the classical music world, is the person who created those features you may have seen in the New York Times that I love that are very sort of popularizing 5 minutes to make you love Mozart, 5 minutes to make you love opera. He can turn from writing a serious article about what is going on at this institution, what does this performance mean, and then to say, well, now you're on the obituaries desk is sort of not inviting him to do new forms, I guess. So that to me was a real surprise. And also then did get me thinking about how do I value criticism versus previews versus profiles versus news versus music listings, which I'm sure we'll talk about a bit too.
Definitely, yeah. All those particular forms, I think, are addressed in a piece that we can bring up a little later. Catherine, any thoughts to add? I mean, as a theater critic, is there to hear that a theater critic at the paper of record is not going to be in that role anymore?
Yeah, I was unsettled and I was surprised because, to be honest, Jesse Green's not my favorite theater critic. I often get very frustrated reading his reviews, but I still like living in a media landscape where he has a job, where there is a position for a full-time theater critic. So I was quite unsettled by the shakeup.
Yeah, that's kind of the thing, right? Like you, as a both a reader and certainly on the artist perspective, like it's very, a part of the equation can be having these relationships with the critics, and sometimes they're contentious, even though they may not know you personally, but you may have this contentious relationship with their relationship with the work or the way that they reflect the work, which all feels very personal, which I think is a big part of it too. Eric, I mean, you as a theater critic, as someone who just finished running a master's program for ostensibly arts journalism and potential future critics for 10 years. I mean, what do you make of that? Is it something that comes up in the curriculum too?
Yeah, well, I mean, and I heard Mona say surprised. I heard Catherine say unsettled. And I guess I would describe myself as shocked, but not surprised. You know, it was jarring to see that. And I say this as someone, I mean, Jesse actually helped me get my first book deal. It was something that came through Jesse, and I've known Zach for a while. You know, these are people who I agree with Mona, who are extremely capable of taking on the new task as it appears to be defined. But I guess I would push back a little bit on this idea that criticism, whoever's going to be in those 4 jobs, will still be a full-fledged critic. They just might not be a critic whose job 40 hours a week is to type words in a row that then get put on the website or the newspaper, and it's telling that I put it in that order. You know, they're still going to be thinking a lot about the culture. They're still going to be putting those thoughts into words, and then those words in some format are going to be put out under the New York Times banner. Mm-hmm. And so that's still a good thing.
And did you find, like, is that I mean, so you took over the program in 2015, and so from the past 10 years, just thinking about the media changes also in the landscape as you're schooling these students to enter a professional media landscape that keeps changing, where it is becoming multi-platform by the day. Is that, I guess, how did that kind of come up in the curriculum? And I know part of that is not you yourself, but also getting the right people in the room to talk about that.
Sure,
too.
yeah. I mean, absolutely. The curriculum had changed in the 10 years before I came on as director, and very much changed during the 10 years. And a lot of that was, for me at least, you know, knowing what I know and what I don't know, and finding people who can actually augment and supplement. So, of course, I mean, every one of these students who typically are digital natives who come in with much higher baseline knowledge than I do on day one, I don't have much to teach them in terms of the craft of the multi-platform stuff. It's just how to channel your knowledge and expertise into that form. So they've led us to a certain degree, but we've brought in, I'm fortunate to teach at a school at Syracuse that has a really robust faculty and a lot of people with a lot of different areas of expertise. And so I feel like the students are actually pretty well covered should they choose to be. A lot of it comes in electives, not required classes, but they can come out of there pretty well versed in this stuff, and we certainly encourage them to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I just have a thought, just considering the idea of getting formal training in this, because I have to say, although I have training in music and I have a library degree and I've been on the air a lot, my training as a critic, besides taking a class in writing program notes and generally for music about general audiences, was when I lived in Charleston, West Virginia. I picked up a side gig writing reviews for $35 a review on a 1 or 2 hour deadline for the Charleston Gazette. And this older reporter, Bob Schwartz here, says on the phone, and he says, well, what I want you to know is I just want to know whether or not you liked it in the first few sentences. And I got to write my first review about Hip Hop Dance, a group called Ill Style and Peace, something I felt highly unqualified to write about. But it was just so it's sort of interesting because they were just kind of like go and, you know, you evolve ideas. Because actually, opposite of what that first training was, is that since then I feel I've evolved that idea. Someone once said, I more talk about what to pay attention to than what I like. So, which is completely opposite. And he's like, look, I've got to know whether or not you liked it. Whether it was good or bad, start there. But there's so much more to it. So,
yeah, that's like I feel like that kind of gets into something maybe we should establish here near the beginning of the show, which is like, what is the role of the arts critic, right? And is that different now than it was 3 to 5 years ago, 25 years ago? And I assume the answer is yes. But I guess broadly speaking, so Mona, you see it more, you see it less as a sort of binary, liked it, didn't like it, consumer thing, and more of an exploration kind of thing.
Yeah, which also is perhaps different than I think as I read older historical things. It's not whether or not that critic likes it, it's whether or not it is good. Forget, they are in a way, that voice of God thing, right? Like, not, I feel this way, the world should feel this way, So then I guess I'm going even beyond my perspective. But like Catherine mentioned, liking or disliking a critic, that's, like I can think of, like, Ebert liked this or didn't. I kind of know where his sympathies lie with movies, or, other things like that. So I guess I'm getting into a lot of different ideas.
Sure.
But there's the established voice that you get to know that person. Is it personal? Is it not? Is it about me, the writer? Is it about you, the reader? Or where does that intersect?
Yeah, what were you going to say,
Yeah,
Catherine?
well, I've heard Jesse Green describe the importance of a critic's taste being consistent. So then people know, okay, do I generally agree? Do I generally disagree? That's more important than some arbiter of like, is this good? Is this bad? For me, I think of criticism as an important way for audiences to get information about a piece of art or a media that's not coming from the people trying to sell it to them. It's a more neutral way to get a sense of what a show is doing from the perspective of an outsider who's not directly involved in that show.
Yeah, context is a big part of it, right?
Well, and to the question of taste, I mean, one of the very first assignments I would give my students is Patrick's. If we didn't mention Patrick's a former
Yeah, I
student,
should
of
probably
mine, so
disclose
he
that
should-
too, yeah.
So Patrick did it. So did Leah Stacy, Patrick's boss. But I'd say they have to go find a piece of writing, a review, and it had to meet two criteria. One, they had to think it was a very well, it's presumably of something they'd seen or listened to or whatever, and they had to think it was a really well written, cogent, good review. And B, it had to have the complete opposite opinion of the piece than they themselves had. So, go and find a pan of something they loved or vice versa. And one of the students in your cohort, I remember, and she she called her mom. She was so upset about this review that hated The Fifth Element, which she loved The Fifth Element. But it got to the core of like, okay, so if typically what you think of, oh, I like that review, which usually just like they said what I would have said, just with bigger words or whatever. Like, no, they're coming at it from they have a completely different set of litmus tests or whatever criteria they're looking at, but it still succeeds on some level, even though they got it wrong.
And there's some element to the point of consistency that you brought up, Catherine. There's almost like you get to know a critic's taste. You get to know maybe what you may come to expect, and then to see them deviate from that or what you thought they were going to do was like genuinely thrilling to me. Like when you get your critics who you're like, man, I can't wait to read this person's take on this. They're going to hate it. And then it's like, they loved it. That's totally inconsistent with what I thought they were going to do because as my relationship with them. So that's kind of cool too. Like that creates like a third, or I don't know how many number of dialogues or like avenues to engage with the art, but it creates another way of engaging with the art that I think is really exciting.
It's like a heel turn.
Yeah, that's right.
It's like with John Cena or whatever, all of a sudden it comes out and
It's like Robert Christgau suddenly liking some prog rock or something.
There you go.
Right.
And softening their long-held positions of being anti-something, yeah. And I think, like, I guess have the as critics and as folks who are invested in that conversation, have you seen anyone seen the role change dramatically recently, or I guess I should say the expectations of the role, and maybe that is the way that it's seen or the way it's expected to be seen, or like why do people come to critics? I mean, is it just other critics? Is it people who develop these relationships from as we were kind of saying, more of a consumer, avatar perspective, as Richard Brody says in his piece? I don't know. Is that different now? Are the expectations of it different now that can be seen?
I'd say in music, I can easily stream something and sample it, so I don't have to necessarily read what you say before I go buy the record. I can just be like, well, why don't I just go preview it on Spotify? Why do I have to hear what you think? Is
Yeah.
one sort of difference in music criticism, but then again, there's also so much information out there. I think it's probably different for live performances, for theater, for other experiences.
Yeah, something that I've seen within the realm of theater is critics who are coming from underrepresented groups, kind of speaking truth to power in their reviews, and occasionally that can put pressure on productions to perhaps do better. I'm thinking about how Christian Lewis wrote a review criticizing Jagged Little Pill for having a non-binary character not played by a non-binary actor. And while they didn't change that for the Broadway production, my understanding is that the tour production, there was more of a effort to cast that role appropriately. So criticism as a way of actually impacting and changing and pushing productions to be more thoughtful and inclusive in the work they're doing.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, criticism as activism, perhaps a little bit in that way too. Yeah.
And a lot of this comes down to who you're writing for, who your imagined or real audience is. I mean, you don't see this in theater as much, but I know in film, I've always been amazed when I see people walk out of a movie theater And some, not all, but some movie theaters will have like a large blown up thing of the review that's out on like poster board, and people will walk out of the movie they have just seen to then stop and like read that review. So obviously for them, it's not playing the role of like, oh, is this worth my time? Should I go see this? They already saw it. So it's not necessarily as like the consumer guide of like, this is worth your time, this isn't. Also, like in classical music and theater, if you don't live in New York City, your stuff is being read by people who have no intention of actually getting to that show. TV and film is a little bit different because it's always an option, but these finite, a review of a one-night concert, no one's going back to that concert. It's just a question of like experiencing it and having some sense of what happened.
Yeah,
what
there's so much going on in the world that I don't get to, but I kind of know, like, oh, this person's doing this now, or start to form my own opinions, even though I wasn't at that show. I feel like Alex Ross, although it did transfer to recordings, Alex Ross in The New Yorker, his reviews of Lorraine Hunt Lieberson singing, performances by French string quartets, things that may eventually tour here to Rochester, but I didn't get to see, like that sort of helped shaped my interests and where I went and looked for things.
Yeah.
Yeah, to get to your earlier point, I always, after I see a movie, if it's like really impacted me or I'm trying to unpack what the movie was doing, I usually go home and I read as many reviews as I can because that helps me think more about what I just saw. And that's something that I hope, I do that also with theater reviews. It's such a treat to be able to see a Broadway show and then be able to read the reviews. Often it's the other way around. I'm just reading the Broadway reviews, trying to get a sense of what's happening. And
Well, that's with movies or with theater in some ways, especially theater, because I know less. There might be some historical context. I may have just seen something, thought that was a neat scene, but you may say, oh, that was clearly a reference to this earlier theater writer because I've been to more theater than you have. So, you're educating me on the language of that art, the references, the signifying, what's happening.
And I think that gets to pretty close to the core of this talk. Anytime there's like a big changing of the guard and there's, voices that have been around longer and have seen more stuff or listened to more stuff. So they have that context and they have those frames of reference, but they maybe don't or perceive not to have, their finger on the pulse of what the kids are listening to or, and so there's often this trade-off of is it worth jettisoning at least some of the former to get more of the latter? And that's a very moving target.
Something that I find interesting about sort of the state of criticism is just the existence of Letterboxd, because Letterboxd is a very, very, very popular now and even more so now that they're sort of a content creator as well, film platform, an app where it's, user reviews power the content of the site. So you watch a movie, you log it, you review it in as many words or as few or as quippy as you want to do. On the platform, you can rate it out of 5 stars. So what I love to do is watch a movie and then go on Letterboxd, and I usually I keep it more as like a log of movies I've seen more than like a sort of like a taste portfolio or something. But I love to scroll through having just seen a movie and see how both seriously some people take the act of reviewing that film and how some people are just trying to fire off a banger tweet basically. And both like to me both of them are both valid forms of criticism, of arts criticism, and it's actually great to see them mingle with each other in this context. And sometimes if it's a movie that I love, I will, because you can sort by, you can hate read as I do, and you can sort by like, okay, who are the people that really hated this movie and what are they saying about it? And then I'll go through and kind of inhale like 20 of those because I'm a sicko, and then I'll be like, yeah, well, actually I see some of those points. I completely disagree with that, but man, I feel very empowered now because I just got the full spectrum of all this stuff. So in that way, I'm like, I kind of feel like it's keeping criticism, especially for film, not afloat necessarily, but I find that it's very much keeping it's keeping people engaged, and it's keeping film watching and interacting like very active, So I don't know. Any of it on Letterboxd?
no, but I do Storygraph, which is like the book equivalent, I guess.
Okay, right. Yeah, which is kind of like a Goodreads sort of.
Yeah.
These where you can kind of gamify it a little bit. It becomes. I don't know. It adds a. I think that there are people who would probably say that, because that's let's be clear, that's a very different thing than the traditional long form review as we sort of know it. But it's also a way of keeping film criticism alive and stuff. So
Yeah, and creating a sense of community around
that's the other.
having seen a movie. You saw
Yes.
it in your small theater with the people around you. Now you can broaden that perspective on what others thought.
Or,
Right.
or in this day and age, best case scenario, you saw it in that small theater with people around you. You're very likely to have watched it at home or even on your phone. So I mean,
Good point.
as the act of going to culture becomes more and more atomized, like I think having these public squares becomes that much more important.
So as critics, do you? So you nodded there. So you're on Letterboxd. So do you?
I lurk on Letterboxd.
Okay, I was gonna say because you're not giving it away for free, right? Yeah. But I do see some people do that. I mean, some film critics will, like David Ehrlich at IndieWire is a big one. He will start his published review on Letterboxd and then be like, click here if you want to read the rest of the review, which I think is a great strategy. So maybe that, and I guess I sort of bring that up to say there's some more language from the New York Times memo sort of relating to these changes. It was reported by Variety and some other outlets. But the language of the memo sort of announcing these critic reassignments was, we're in the midst of an extraordinary moment in American culture. New generations of artists and audiences are bypassing traditional institutions. Smartphones have balkanized fandoms even as they have made culture more widely accessible than ever. And arts institutions are facing challenges and looking for new opportunities. So, I mean, all of that true. One way of, I guess, of thinking about what it is to engage with even those fandoms is thinking about Letterboxd, I think, as one possible example. So, but I'm also like, even the New Yorker does this, a version of this where, you know, Richard Brody, Ingu Kang, Justin Chang will all sit down, their critics will sit down to camera, shoot interviews, just talking about the stuff that they're watching. And, you know, it's high production value. They're not doing it in their car the way that you might see some other videos online. But these are tools that critics are using now. So, yeah, there's a little bit of, I guess, the like just industry-wide, these are very common practices for arts critics at this point, right? And so I think like there's, I guess to your point, Eric, the shocked but or not shocked but or surprised, like there's a certain element of getting with the times, you know, already this type of technology being multi-platform and finding people is kind of already happening. Yeah.
And I mean, one of the classes I teach, you know, writing for both budding print journalists, or what we used to call print journalists, and broadcast journalists, and you know, and the scripts are different. If Patrick were to take something he had written at City and read it on the air, it would not sound right. Same with taking your script that you're doing here and like printing that out. Like, it's two very different voices. We're on the air right now. No one is going to rewind us a little bit to hear that sentence a second time. They could, presumably, but they're not going to. Whereas you do that, I mean, it's just the eye and the ear process words differently. Right. And so it's a different discourse. And it's easy for people like me from the print, where the words typically have an extra syllable or two, to hold that at a different stratum or level. And it's silly. Like, it's not, it's all how you think about this stuff. But it is different, and it is important to be able to think about it as all of those are venues that you need to make sure you're reaching your audience.
Yeah, because audience is a question, too, that I want to talk
about.
But
Also I want to say we've taken some of our print city reviews and turned them into radio pieces, and we've sort of learned this thing that we know, that you tell the story a little differently. Right. You illustrate things. I love, you hear music reviews on Fresh Air on public radio, and they can sort of, you know, illustrate things, and there's a different approach to it for sure. But yeah, the audience is, I mean, in some ways we both are audience and creator, because I think a lot of musicians like reading about it. Some people who have become artists in these fields say they found their first love through reading about this far-off world, right? You're a kid in suburban New Jersey, say, reading about the theater world of New York City, and, you know, someday you go there, but you experience it in this completely remote world, like, you know, this way through that. But for other people, I don't know. So in other ways, though, I can't speak to a typical audience perspective because I'm in the midst of it so far. So.
Well, and I was curious, from your perspective, Catherine, like, are you know, let's say you're writing about the newest show at Blackfriars, or you're reviewing the Rochester Community Players Shakespeare and Highland Bowl, which we just did. If you can read it on rockcitymag.com, as you can read a lot of Catherine's other work. How much are you thinking about audience when you're crafting those reviews? And I guess, what are you thinking about in terms of audience for reviewing a local production like that?
Well, I think my role as a critic is to help people find the show that they're most going to enjoy. So I try to write in a way that an audience that's trying to get a sense of whether or not they want to go see the show will see if it's going to be worth their time, their effort. I'm also very aware that because Rochester is a small city, probably the people involved in the production will have access to that review. So in the back of my head, I'm sometimes just having that context is useful, thinking about wanting to have a generosity for the work that's being done and uplift more than tear down as much as I can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So is that something that resonates with Eric and Mona? Is that idea of generosity?
I've
too?
reviewed community theater. I've reviewed kids theater in Charleston, West Virginia, and I'm not going to tell you that your 8-year-old is a terrible actor. Like, that is not my role. Obviously, they just want some sort of record. This happened. This is what it's about. So that's like, certainly one show. I just sort of ran out of space or time, and I didn't say anything bad or good about anyone. I just didn't mention someone's part, and they personally wrote me to say, like, why didn't you mention me? Did I do so terribly? I'm just a retired doctor trying to act. And I'm like, It came with a, but like if I trashed Cats though. Andrew Lloyd Webber, it doesn't live next door to me, and I don't have to face him at Wegmans, so
That's true. That's punching up.
But
in a very big way.
yeah, I mean, and punching up is, I don't do it as much now, but grading on a curve essentially, because if the typical audience is coming in to see a free thing of theater or see their kids in a show, like they're coming in with a different set of expectations than someone who's paid. I'm thinking it's $60 or $70 now for Jiva tickets, or RBTL can be even more than that. And so, if people are, not that money dictates all of this, but I mean, it does bring in a certain set of expectations, and they have every right to have those expectations. And so you're kind of meeting the show where it is. And it doesn't mean like patting some people on the head for remembering most of their lines or whatever. I mean, there still are standards, and they still have to meet those standards. But I've done the Mona thing and just sort of forgotten to mention someone that I thought it was kind to not mention.
Yeah, that's my worst nightmare, having somebody personally feel offended by that.
And
I also, thinking about the production and the artists who are in the room putting it on, but also thinking about the actual story that's being told, I often try to question, why are we doing this play now in Rochester? What are some of the messages that are being conveyed through this particular choice, and what is the larger social political context that this work is being done in? So again, just kind of giving that context, and that's not saying yay or nay on this 8-year-old, but more like, what is it that these children are, like, what is the story these children are telling?
Or this Jane Eyre production at Jiva.
Like why are we putting certain narratives on stage?
Yeah, that's a big part of it too, right? And I think it's so funny to think about the reviewing children's theater, because it's like it almost like it there's no presumption that you're going to go out of that with, as a critic, saying like, definitely thumbs down, like there, because also it's like not as interesting if that's what your goal is. It's more interesting to talk about what was the experience like, what did it remind you of, where did it take your mind, And I think that's actually something that that Richard Brody gets into in this piece that Mona and I were also speaking about before this. Is Richard Brody, the longtime film critic at The New Yorker, wrote a piece after this news came out about sort of a defense of the traditional review, and he kind of lays out like what that is and what it's not, and even sort of kind of goes to bat for different forms of writing, like festival roundups, music roundups. Those are criticism. He even makes the case that like a reporter profile can be like backdoor criticism, which I think is really interesting too. So yeah.
And the article that I've been pairing it with is an Atlantic article by composer pianist Gabriel Kahane, who calls his article a love letter to music listings, but he really does get a little bit into criticism too. He talks about moving to New York City and Time Out New York, and actually another great critic that I love, Steve Smith, who now has a Substack, Night After Night, which kind of summarizes the sense, and he still does listings of concerts in New York along with reviews and other things that Kahane then sort of laments that even though he does it both as an artist promoting himself and to read this fragmented world of Instagram, that do you catch this thing or not, versus sort of this introduction to, I guess, as I love Alex Ross's book title, listen to this. Listen to this. Here, come on in, right?
Oh, I love that. Yeah, there have been shows that just weren't on my radar or wasn't, based on the marketing, didn't think I would like. And then I see a review or a description from a critic I respect, and it changes my interest in that, maybe motivates me to go see something that I wouldn't have otherwise cared about.
So we're talking about the state of arts criticism here on Connections. Mona Segatola-Slami is here, Catherine Varga, and Eric Grody. We are going to talk more about this. We're going to take a phone call right after we take our only break of the hour. So stay tuned here on Connections.
One of the best ways to support WXXI is to become a sustaining member. You give a little bit each month, and your contribution renews automatically every year. Sustaining members provide a stable source of revenue for your favorite programs. For as little as $5 a month, you can become a sustaining member at WXXI.org.
Welcome back to Connections here on WXXI. We have been talking about the state of arts criticism with Eric Grody. Catherine Varga, Mona Segatola-Slami is also here. We do have a caller, Phil from Brighton. Thanks for calling in, Phil. What do you have to say on the state of arts criticism here in Rochester?
Well, this is a very theoretical discussion because there really isn't any. There's no outlet for criticism in town. City newspaper in its new incarnation doesn't publish any. I understand it's a monthly rather than a weekly, which is a problem, but the newspaper doesn't. And as our music director announced at the last concert of the year, he just said the media in Rochester ignore the symphony, and to the best of my knowledge, they ignore Jiva and any of the other arts happening in town. And this, I think, is a big loss for the town. In many cities where the newspapers have cut back on critics, kind of arts criticism websites have popped up in New York City, where the Times has cut back severely in terms of music criticism. There's, I think it's called New York Classical Review, but there's nothing in Rochester. And I don't understand this conversation because this is all very theoretical. Reading the New Yorker reviews is great, but there is no outlet for Rochester. So I guess I'd like your comments on that.
Yeah, I appreciate the call. Mona, I think, has something to say here. I just wanted to say also up front, I think by and large publications have, scaled back critics. I think that's definitely true. We are joined by two of the folks who do put criticism in City Mag in this room too. So I just want to shout out Catherine. A lot of Catherine's reviews end up going online. That's a virtue of, as Phil pointed out, the fact that City is a monthly. So, just in terms of turnaround, especially giving the value to the people about a show that might only be open for a weekend. That's part of the reason why what Catherine does, and, the quick turnaround too, which is a great credit to you. Mona does a lot of City music criticism in City as well. But I think as music director, you might have some thoughts on this,
Well,
too.
yeah, I was just going to first speak up for City, that there are 4 published music reviews a month, online and in print. And I read Catherine's theater reviews, actually, because although I try and keep track of everything, I'm not as connected. And so I read about the Shakespeare in the Park. I read about plays at Jiva at Blackfriars, some that I get to, some I don't. So that's there, but you do have to be online because of the timeliness of the theater reviews. And then I'd say in terms of coverage, this gets back to the music listings, perhaps as a sort of form of criticism. We just got, it's not big reviews, analyzing the clarinet solo and all of that. But one, besides broadcasting the RPO concerts on classical, we do arts listings every day. And we just got a lovely email from a listener who said 3 things he did in the last week he wouldn't have done if he hadn't been listening to our station. And sort of that's the same role as the Daily To-Do and the City Magazine calendar. It is fragmented, and it's been harder, I think, to reconnect with sources of information, especially post-pandemic. But I do think we're really committed to that, because someone said they learned about a Water Lotus festival, and they said that the people there said no one's really covering it as much, but our listener heard us talk about it, heard Chinese music. He saw the Met Opera at the movies, and he saw Geneva Light Opera production of Falstaff, which perhaps he wouldn't have learned about somewhere else. So I guess I want to say that we're definitely trying, but it is, again, hard. Perhaps you missed me announcing that at that one point. Should I be doing a sit down with Patrick every week and talking about my favorite arts events this weekend? I maybe so, and with Brenda Tremblay and with Steve, who puts together Arts Calendar. But I guess especially the interview artists who've been part of the RPO, we've covered, the opera. There's a lot going on, which is great. Rochester is a very, very rich arts community, and there's, as we even expand, which is good, what we talk about in the arts, right? The art of, you could both talk about the big symphony concert and the Jiva play or the community theater production that's really popping up or an interesting art opening. There's so much. So what rises to the top and how? Dance is something that I don't know as much about, but I've read more coverage of in city recently, actually.
Yeah.
So I am on the inside, so I'm a little biased. But I really think I believe that is so important. Those things that the arts organizations and audiences are concerned about, and I just want to find the way.
Yeah.
One thing I do at the beginning of every single month now is I pick up City and I start folding, dog-earing the pages and marking in my calendar, 11 or 12 things over the month that's in the middle of the issue is it's essentially an arts listings. It's an arts calendar. Now, do I get to all 11 or 12 of those? No, probably not. But I mean, I that's one of the ways that I absolutely try to flag. So I feel like City's way out in front, as much as a monthly can be. That does have to take good work like Catherine's and make it accessible online.
And then we do have people, maybe this is again the fragmentation, is that if you follow Greg Bell at Jazz Rochester, he has an all jazz calendar, and that is an online thing with an email and listing. And he really gets in there from every jazz band playing at a wine bar to major concerts like Branford Marsalis.
And I think to that point, that brings up something I was going to mention too, Mona, is sort of the specialization of a lot of the arts coverage and certainly arts criticism. It's happening. The Jazz Rochester is a great website. I think we actually, I believe City actually did a piece on him last year just to talk about what that work actually what that work requires to really maintain the sort of up-to-date jazz pulse of the city. But just in terms of critics not being necessarily at the legacy media publications anymore or being on staff, you mentioned Steve Smith and his Substack is that he runs is essentially where we started to have the conversation about what this edition of this conversation here on Connections could be like. So a lot of critics go to starting their own Substacks, and they become more individualized, specialized voices, which certainly is a fragmentation. It's not as central as going to one place and kind of being the case. But I think that's just sort of a reflection of I think the state of media and sort of the it kind of presents a lot of different avenues for people to create that themselves and to kind of start those conversations themselves on Substack, but also, they're making it work for themselves to still be right. But it becomes harder to. I saw someone tweet once it would be great if all these really talented writers who have their own Substacks could all be published in one place. I don't know what you would call that though. Maybe a magazine, So it's kind of the larger media trends are,
And we have a
part of this
gain and a
conversation.
loss from some of this fragmentation, because when it used to only be one critic or one outlet or one or two, you lost a lot of voices, or, you have fringes of fringes where people were doing interesting work, but it wasn't reaching more attention. So that's perhaps a lot of this is valorizing. I don't know if it's 70s, 80s, downtown New York, where people were reviewing things at the Metropolitan Opera next to John Zorn and really unusual sort of out there stuff side by side. Now it's all out there, but how do you find the center? So.
Yeah, there's. I mentioned this piece before the break. Richard Brody, the longtime New Yorker film critic, wrote this piece in the New Yorker called "In Defense of the Traditional Review," partly in response to the New York Times critic reassignment. I just want to read a part of it, and we can sort of bring this up and sort of go in a lot of different directions with it. But so this is, he wrote it in the piece, I'm not spreading my arms out in front of traditional reviews to protect them from insult or attack. Rather, I'm advocating for them, not in order to preserve the status quo or revive past practices, but to advance the cause of art itself, because reviews, far from being conservative, as the New York Times memo implies, are the most inherently progressive mode of arts writing. When writing reviews, critics are in the position of the public, which we talked about before. Watching a movie, attending a concert, seeing a play, buying a record. Reviews are rooted in the most fundamental unit of the art business, which is the personal encounter with individual works, and in the economic implications of that encounter. The specificity of the review is both aesthetic and social. Critics are simultaneously consumers and avatars of consumers. And then he quotes Pauline Kael, writing in The New Yorker in 1971, saying, without a few independent critics, there's nothing between the public and advertisers. So the independence, I think, is another big part of this, too. I think that came up earlier in our thing. Any general thoughts on that and kind of that relationship? Catherine, anything?
Yeah, well, something more broadly speaking about writing in general that terrifies me is the normalization of using AI to generate text. And I feel like reviews are one of those things that it's more obvious or more like hollow to try to right, like how can AI predict a review of what is a very personal experience, going to a concert, going to a movie. Um, so that's in one regard where I feel like hopefully that type of writing is needs to be protected and supported in order to keep that conversation going.
Definitely, even as the long form criticism is being used to train the generative models, but that's a different conversation.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, I don't know, that sort of came up. I think the independence part came up earlier, didn't it, Mona?
Yeah, well, and it's weird because I think of myself as in a weird position in terms of independence because I also book bands. So, I am in all parts of and maybe all of us live in these different ways. And I think each of these publications often have sort of standards. New York Times specifically, I think, talks about like doesn't serve on boards, won't serve on panels or on other things. But in other ways, we consider our embeddedness in the community of value. That's how we can tell you why the story matters or pick up on that actor doing that means something special because of their past. Again, that sort of longitudinal look at what's going on.
How many? Can I ask another from your standpoint, Eric, of being a former director of this arts journalism program? Were there a lot of students that would come in asking, "I want to learn," or sort of with the goal of learning how to do like traditional reviews, as kind of we're talking about them and what that definition is?
Yeah, I think Syracuse and Newhouse is a very legacy place. It's 3 big buildings that have the First Amendment plastered on one side. It definitely does signal this is a place that's been doing what it's been doing for a long time. And so I think that probably selects for people who are at least respectful of and aware of the value of how it used to be done. And it's something that I, in part because it's what I grew up doing and got to the point where I felt I could teach, doing an older model of doing it. So I don't think anyone there was coming to Newhouse purely to be the new TikTok. There wasn't such a thing as TikTok when I started or when you were there.
Right.
But I think everyone there realizes that there's like print, inches of copy on a piece of paper or just switched over on the CMS to the website has any kind of monopoly on insight or value. And in fact, if you're talking about music, like being able to do it where like the 5 minutes where you can actually hear some of the music or you can actually see things. There's a lot to be gained by using these multi-platform things.
Or from our area, Rick, is it Beato or Beato?
Yeah, Beato.
Beato, who does these amazing music essays that, again, are not necessarily criticism, but again, in that model of pay attention to this, listen to this, understand this, the sort of critic as educator side. I guess that's also the thing. Whether it's positive, negative, neutral, the scariest thing is actually no one's going to say anything about you in any platform.
Yeah, and later in the piece, that independence part comes in where Richard Brody essentially makes the case that even a well-reported and sort of embedded profile of an artist while in the promotion cycle or the marketing cycle for their new work is inherently promotional because you're sort of in that conversation with them. Whereas criticism stands apart from that and doesn't have to be like play that game, so to speak, which I think is very interesting. And I think it also kind of ties into in my head, it ties into this question of there are some, I think, misunderstandings about the role of I know we sort of established this, but like, do you all have things that you think that people misunderstand about the role of criticism? Because this comes up thankfully I'm not on Twitter anymore, but I used to spend too much time when like a new pop star had an album out and then there would be some sort of mini controversy where the fans would go against the critic of a particular publication, and sometimes there was doxing. Like it can get kind of dark. All of this because in many cases, what was largely a pretty like fair and in some cases largely complimentary review, it just wasn't superlative or whatever. So that's when I start to think, well, maybe the role of criticism isn't really understood. And is that something that comes up for you, Catherine?
Yeah, well, I think sometimes, depending on going back to kind of who that audience is, a big audience for reviews is marketers who read a review looking for how can I use this to help sell a show. I had a friend who worked in marketing who would complain about one critic in particular who wrote very positive reviews, but not in a way that they could like pick out phrases.
They're
and
like, "Where's the
parts.
pull quote?"
Yeah.
And yeah, that's kind of my goal is to have that. Give marketers a hard time.
I would say I do think there is a stereotype of I would call it like the Ratatouille Birdman kind of stereotype of these critics who are just these vipers who live for nothing more than to just rip apart everything they see or listen to. And I mean, like, we wouldn't go out 3-4 nights a week and subject ourselves to something that made us miserable. Like, we're doing it because we at least potentially love every single thing we're going to see. We don't always love everything, but the hope is always to do that. And if you can find something, it's a great feeling, especially if it's something's burbling up to the surface. You feel like you can help pull it up there. And then sometimes if you're doing your job responsibly means steering people away toward what you deem the good stuff, toward the good stuff and away from the bad stuff, like that's part of the job. But we're not like rubbing our hands in glee at the prospect.
Yeah, we love this form, like whether it's music, theater, we're doing it because we're really passionate about it. We want to see it at its best. So sometimes it is frustrating when you see something that's not as good as it could be.
Yeah.
But,
And that is reminds me of something more from my radio side of things and criticism. Someone said about audiences for classical music, for public radio, they say they may not like everything you do, but what's really special about them and you, he said, was that they will go to great lengths to find one thing they truly love. And that's like right, there's a lot of stuff that's pretty good, stuff you don't like, but to find that thing that is like, that this band could be your life kind of feeling is really special. And someday somebody introduced you to, someone put that tape on the first time, or they, for me, mentioned Mitski in a New Yorker article, and I thought, who's that?
Yeah.
So that's really wonderful to open a door for someone. So I think in addition to loving the arts that we're covering is loving the feeling of being like, here, friend, But I was just thinking the other thing for me, and I don't know if I mentioned, sort of my dilemma between like it or not, or at least what to pay attention to. My other thing when I reviewed reviews of something I've been at that drives me nuts is my goal is always to have it actually resemble that we were in the audience at the same show. The weirdest reviews are to me, whether or not we agree, whether you liked it, but I'm like, did we actually sit in the same theater and go to the same movie, play, concert? What? So yeah, that I don't know if that's part of it also that's one of my standards for a review. We were in the same room, right?
Yeah, that seems like a pretty basic one. I had a poetry professor once who said, it's poetry. This is a pretty subjective thing, but we can all agree, right, that this is a Philadelphia poem and not an Arizona poem, or he had some sort of thing like that. But it's like, we all want to be in the same room. So whether that's quite literally the same room when you're talking about live performance or the metaphorical room of understanding art kind of under the same sort of umbrella or using the same kinds of tools.
That's super interesting to me because sometimes when I see a show, I feel like I'm in a different room than the audience. Whether it's because everybody around me is just like thunderously laughing, applauding, and I'm stony-faced, feeling like that stereotypical critic.
Okay, there is a certain movie musical touring production I saw recently that I did feel I was in a very different room than everybody else, perhaps a different DeLorean.
Right. So I feel like part of the role of the critic, though, is to understand, like, okay, this is not for me, but this is clearly tapping into something that everybody else, what is that thing, and how can I convey it in a way while also staying true to my voice and what I felt like was unimpressive about the show.
But when I'm working with my students and I'm workshopping some of their pieces of criticism, their reviews, I find they're often talking about how the audience loved this or the audience was really into this. And to me, that's only valuable in the context of a review if you are swimming against the tide of that. Like if you're just sort of saying, like, if I want to know what a lot of people think of something, I'll just go to Rotten Tomatoes or Metacritic. Like I'm interested in your specific, your unique experience of it and what that is. And so the people around you are really have no bearing on that unless it's what Mona's tactfully not naming as a reason.
Well, I'd say also that Cats review where I trashed Cats that I did say, I was not having a good time, but everybody around me was happily singing and clapping along to Mr. Mistopheles, so I tried to express the mismatch.
What's that old was that can 50 million Elvis fans be wrong or whatever?
Right.
Like, actually, yes, they could be. I don't think they are in his case, but of course they could be, and that's telling when sometimes things are, running askance to the prevailing opinion. Like, there's nothing wrong with that.
So I think that in our last few minutes here, because we got to wrap up in a few, although we could obviously talk about this for probably 3 more hours. Is there one piece of criticism that you return to, one that you try to use as like a guiding a guiding light or a North Star, or just something that you outright hated that stays with you because you just can't believe how wrong they got it? That's something I'm fascinated with, because I have one that was a very online thing, but it's at the website Stereogum. They celebrated the 10-year anniversary of the third Strokes album, which, like, for Strokes fans is like a largely inconsequential album because the first two are the ones that everyone talks about. But it was written in such a way that threaded a lot of like contemporary pop and rock history into this album that's largely inconsequential, which I found to be a fascinating approach to stuff. So is there stuff like that? Is there stuff that maybe wanted you to that made you want to try it yourself? Maybe, I don't know. I can start with whoever maybe has one at the ready or who doesn't. But
well, a review that kind of changed or helped me understand what reviews can do is Deep Tran's review of Miss Saigon, which is a show that I had mixed feelings about, but having a Vietnamese critic base a review that was very personal, but also like recognized the context of the show, was like, oh, you can have like weird feelings about a show and a critic can put it in a way that elucidates what is problematic or uncomfortable about what's happening on stage.
Okay, Mona, do you have one quickly?
I have there's a book I like, and I feel bad I can't remember the author because it's great writing. It's just interesting thinking about all this. It's that 33 1/3 series where people normally write about albums they love so much.
Right.
But this author wrote about Celine Dion, and it's called something like In the Limits of Taste. So he explores the idea of what taste is to him.
Oh, yeah. Okay, Eric.
I'll go back to my origin story. Raiders of the Lost Ark was the first movie I was allowed to go see by myself. I saw it about a dozen times. Pauline Kael ripped it apart in The New Yorker, and I was deeply troubled by that.
And yet,
But I go back.
look where you ended up. Which is the power of criticism, right?
That's my radioactive spider.
Well, we've been talking about the state of arts criticism. I want to thank Eric Grody, Associate Professor at the Newhouse School at Syracuse University. Catherine Varga, theater critic. You can read her work at City. Mona Segatola-Slamy, WXXI Classical Music Director. You can read her work also at City. I'm Patrick Hoskin. Thanks, everybody, for joining, and More Connections is up next.
This program is a production of WXXI Public Radio.